Welcome to Aleatory Encounters, a Steiner Books podcast. What you are about to listen to is an audio snapshot of an in-person human conversation that took place here at our offices in Spencertown, New York. In this episode with Joe Allen. This is our first attempt at doing a recorded conversation.
You got to slide into the human-machine interface.
Yeah. My plan for this was, one, to only do person to person when people happen to be coming through the area to talk in person in my office. And the second was to have no plan. Like no plan, no questions, nothing.
You can count on me for no plan.
So the idea is just to see what happens, although I will have to, I guess, talk about your book. So the book is about where we're heading with technology and the interface between humanity and artificial intelligence. But it's also a very personal book too, which is what I appreciate about it. You know a lot about where we are technologically, but you're not going along with it necessarily, right?
Try not to.
And so part of what your journey is right now is that you want to meet people in person, and you're not just doing Zoom calls, you're driving a vehicle across the country, meeting people face to face. So what is the qualitative difference between that and a Zoom call?
It's a night and day. You know, I never really did Zoom, anything like that, until I started working for the War Room. I do like the freedom of being able to move around and have just a computer that you're beholden to, but in general, there's a degree of artificiality to it that I really don't care for. Even, people who have done Zoom calls with 10, 20 people, it's like you're looking into a wasp nest with little larvae peering back at you. It's disconcerting. It's very thin as compared to having a room full of people sniffing and coughing and shuffling around in their chairs. And then, of course, actually being able to speak to the people, ask them questions, and get a sense of what your words are doing to them as you're speaking, seeing the looks, the expressions on their faces. So most of my life has been spent in some sort of either a natural setting, not unlike the one we're in right now with lots of woodlands and very few people, or in very urban environments with lots and lots of people, but I am with people. This move towards the digital in our culture is stripping away both the skills that people need to connect with and survive in nature, and also the social skills to navigate the dense urban landscape. And I think that atrophy of what we are just as biological beings, just not even to mention the spiritual aspect, that atrophy is readily apparent in large swaths of the population. In the beginning you said, I'm trying not to go along with it. Yes, but the irony is that the more that I have researched and described our present moment in technology, the more technology has become a companion in my life, more so than human beings at certain points.
I've found the same thing. Where we're going, is it necessarily inevitable? If it is not inevitable, what is the positive response, right? So in your subtitle, The War Against Humanity, it's a war. Is it a war?
Absolutely.
How do we negotiate this?
Well, it depends on what side you're on. If you enter any war without the conviction that you're going to win, you're definitely going to lose. I don't see anything as being inevitable, mainly because people's predictions of inevitability tend not to come true. So some do, some don't. And then even among those people who have accurately predicted the future, they have many inaccurate predictions. So I think that it's more a loose guide, a guide to approximations rather than definites. But what you can discern from where we're at right now is a trajectory towards something very different from what we are right now, from what social life is, from what the human being is, from what spiritual narratives and mythos are. So the inevitable for me is more just a sense of a trajectory. And that trajectory is being determined to some extent by the people creating these devices. That future is being determined by the people who desire and adopt those devices. It'll be determined by the successes or the failures of the various devices. But ultimately, in any conception of artificial intelligence or the mechanization of society, taken to its logical extent, it erases what it is to be human. It's not necessarily a conscious war, although I do suspect that there are many intelligences behind it that are not so readily apparent to the senses. Whatever is driving the war, I don't pretend to be able to see beyond the veil, but whatever is driving this war is fairly indifferent to the enduring dignity and the enduring identity of human beings as we are now. If you think about the changes that have happened in the last 3 centuries, if you go back just even 2 centuries ago, how incredibly different we are externally in our outward cultural environment and internally in our as psychological beings. We're not exactly a different species, but we're a radically different expression of a species that was fairly constant, fairly stable. Now we're seeing changes in what it means to be human that are occurring over the course of decades, and if the acceleration picks up, it will be in the course of years, that certain human beings will be radically different from what came before. So the first level, it's warfare against human identity. It's warfare against the very concept of what it means to be human, to be a biological being, to be in connection with other people in organic settings, to be still and silent with oneself, all of those, that and many other things.
What about a spiritual being?
The spiritual, if we can bracket that for just a moment, is maybe even more radical. But just to say that the war against humanity is, on the first level, a narrative war. It's a psychological war. So a war of information. Who do you believe you are? Where do you believe you came from? Where do you believe you're going? And to the extent there's a we, put a we in there. The other aspect of it, though, is you have strains of futurism. Transhumanism, posthumanism, long-termism. You have strains of futurism which predict that artificial intelligence will completely displace human beings as the apex predator in the current biosphere. And there are various narratives as to where that goes, but at the very least we become subjugated, and at the most we are completely destroyed. Mm-hmm. So at that point it becomes very much a physical war. But these are all just dreams at the moment. I think that the most likely scenario would be human beings employing these tools to eradicate their rivals. I think that's going to be far sooner than any sort of AI takeover.
Wait a minute, say that again. The first thing is that it will be used in human-to-human combat.
It is being used in human-to-human combat, whether it's economic, whether it's political, whether it's religious, and then, of course, militarily, it's being used extensively. Max Moore, the man who coined the term transhumanism, he sees transhumanism at its root, its etymological root just means beyond the human, or across human, across concepts, across categories. But Max Moore and his wife Natasha Vita Moore, at least in their rhetoric, they believe that what they are pushing for is to become more human.
Yeah.
More human than human. And their strain, I would say, is a kind of conservative strain, just to use a common term. So they don't see it as a war against humanity. They see it as an extension of humanity.
We're doing this recording in the context of Steiner Books, the publishing of Rudolf Steiner's works in English in America, North America. As you point out in your book, where do you pinpoint where this process began? I mean, you can keep going back and all the way back to Gandhi Shapur or something like that. To like where does technology start? But at the beginning of the 20th century, a lot of what you're describing was described in a different way by Rudolf Steiner. And I think what he described is so relevant for right now that it's not really widely known or part of the bigger conversation. And yet there's certain fundamental truths there, or fundamental questions. What is it to be a human being? And then the second, what is it to recognize that the human being is not the same thing in time? You know, we kind of assume things about the ancient past, or like the pre-historical past, that human beings were basically been the same throughout time. But we've, sometimes referred to the evolution of consciousness, like the consciousness of someone, an ancient Greek, is different than the consciousness of someone in the Middle Ages, which is different than the consciousness of humanity in general, say at the cross between the 19th and the 20th century. And it was that at that point, which we're still kind of living in now at the beginning of the 21st century, where from the perspective of anthroposophy or Steiner's work, is that it was already apparent 100 years ago that there are two ways that we could go, right? There are two ways. And that seems to me what we're talking about here. They both involve the question, where do we go? Like, because we're not going to stay the same. Our consciousness is not the same now. But it's the question of whether we answer the question of what is it to be human, which has to do with the spirit, which I guess is still in brackets from before.
Let's pull it out.
But yeah, what is it to be human? And the answer to that question has to do with the spirit. It has to do with the soul. And that is a different answer than on the opposite side, on the transhumanism side, that a human being is an animal and the human being can be augmented by machinery, by techniques. And I'm interested in what a human being is. It is, in a sense, a war, but it's a spiritual war. And in being a spiritual war, it's a war of consciousness and intellect and recognition.
I think that while nothing is inevitable, if trends continue, we're going down the path of increased identification, both with the animal self openly. You see the trendiness of evolutionary psychology and the depth of influence that Darwinian evolution has had over our conception of ourselves as human beings. There's more and more identification with those animalistic drives. Simultaneously now, there is more and more identification with our reflection in technology, so that one of the more unsettling trends that we've all seen in the past couple of decades is the development of digital twins, one's virtual self, one's imprint on the digital medium, and an increasing identification among many, if not most, individuals with that digital self as being, in some sense, a true self. And in some ways recapitulates ideas that were voiced in, say, Rosicrucianism, or voiced by Julius Evola, the idea that one creates one's soul beyond this realm, and that in creating that soul, you will have a vehicle that survives death. And the digital does exactly that. It's a zombie for now. It's a Facebook memorial. It's, rows of VHS tapes of family events. But that's the self that survives, and it's tangible, and it becomes a lingering part of the culture. If you're famous, it's a major impact on the culture. If you're not famous, it's just one of many threads running from household to household. But it sustains your physical expression. The spiritual realm, to the extent you're going to separate the spiritual out from the material, the spiritual realm is fairly chaotic in comparison, unless you're adept at exploring it. But even Steiner, who lived his life in a visionary realm, there's certain, what I perceive as being inconsistencies or seeming contradictions or things that seem quite fanciful, and yet there's real piercing insight. If I'm right that there are contradictions, and no need to nitpick on it, I'm no Steiner scholar, but it fits with the general experience that human beings have of the spiritual world, be it through dreams, be it through visions, be it through meditative voyages, be it through being jerked out of your body by beings and taken to other realms. Whatever those descriptions of those experiences are, it's not like going to Africa and slowly but surely putting together a map of the terrain and collecting a taxonomy of the species there, that one to the other, they all line up to form a coherent picture. The spiritual realm, there's a coherent signal somewhere in there, but there's so much chaos between here and there in the imaginative.
That's the actual picture of it, is that between here and the spirit realm, there's an astral realm of confusion.
Yeah.
And that's what most people enter. And that's where a lot of our consciousness and the recently disembodied are dwelling. So you're absolutely right. Steiner described it as sticking your head inside of an anthill. Well, that's what it's like. It's really interesting, and this is why I started reading you. It's like, to me, you just have the natural and unconscious knowledge. Everything you say is just like, okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. From me basically seeing everything through this lens. Like, for me, it's not a belief system so much as just sort of like a worldview, if that makes sense.
Well,
you're saying like you can't know, like you're just saying like it's so confusing when you go into the spiritual world because there's all of this stuff and it's crazy.
Well, what I'm saying
which
is that
true, but I also think that it's possible to be able. It's like everything else in this world. It takes discernment, and like you're going to be fooled, and things are their opposite. And what you said about this specter, this ghost that we create. It's a really important point, and it actually has a lot to do, I think, with being in America, is this entity that Steiner described as the doppelganger, the Ahrimanic double, which is something that we have with us. And it's the Ahrimanic double that we have during an incarnation that sort of joins us and leaves right before we die because it can't go beyond death with us. But the Ahrimanic double wants to live on. It wants to live on. It has the semblance of a kind of life tagging along with every human being, and there's a special relationship for those of us living on the North American continent, but it would like to live on. And so when I hear the folks that you write about in your book and this impulse, we're going to overcome death, which is the greatest hubris ever. Like, I'm too good to die. Like, everything in nature dies and it's reborn. In some sense, even if you don't believe in reincarnation. But what is it that wants to live on in that? What is that impulse? To me, that is what would live on. It wouldn't be the human being. It would be the double. It would be the doppelganger. It would be the demon.
There's a lot of ways to look at it. There's a lot of ideas in and among the futurists. These labels, they're difficult to navigate because they're so imprecise. You look at one person, you call them a transhumanist, but then suddenly they talk about robots taking over. Well, now they're a post-humanist. You look at someone who is a libertarian, pure individualist, and yet they're talking about creating digital hive minds. So the terms can be really, really confusing. But if we just stick with transhumanism as this overarching umbrella for all of it, within that umbrella you have first the idea of life extension. The inevitability of personal death is still within the worldview, but you're going to do everything possible through healthy living and eating vitamins and not jumping off of cliffs, and of course, on down the road, genetic engineering to preserve the body as long as possible. And then overlapping with that, and in some sense coming out of that, the idea that because a lot of that is due to machines, in fact, much of that's made possible by creating a digital twin, by creating a kind of data-driven double of yourself that you're able to actually probe, so your heart rate, your cholesterol levels, the actual structure of your body, all of those things, as they're represented in silico, They make it easier to understand how you can manipulate your body to be more efficient, to make you have more pleasure, and of course to help you live longer. More and more so, though, in certain movements, that would be like the Max Moores, for instance. But more and more so as you move into this identification with the digital, you get this sort of conception of the cyborg, so that what began as a meat being, an organic being, begins to fuse with and merge with that secondary self, that Ahrimanic doppelganger. And the identification of oneself is shifting in that regard. Ray Kurzweil is very much on that wavelength, and his disciples tend to be also on that wavelength. That then kind of forms a conceptual bridge towards the notion of something that is purely digital and yet still alive. So someone like Martine Rothblatt, for instance, the discussion moves to taking that digital twin that's being created moment to moment, especially children today, as their development and their lives, inner and outer, are imprinted on the digital. That digital self, especially as the biological begins to deteriorate, or if it's in any way compromised by injury or death, that digital self then becomes the enduring self, the more important self, the primary self. And as artificial intelligence has evolved very rapidly in the last 10 years, it seems, at least within grasp, to take a person's personality, to take that digital self, and to train an AI on it, or multiple AIs that work in harmony, and extend that person's self and have something that you can interact with. By the way, that already exists. It exists in many forms. They're very clunky. Nobody's going to be rushing to buy them anytime soon. But let's just assume that the progress of the last 10 years continues on for the next 10 years. That would mean that within 10 years, Amazon is going to sell you an afterlife. Because Amazon is in the position, and its partners, they're in the position to record everything about you. And they have the AI that's sufficient to take on aspects of your personality anyway and imitate you. And Rohit Prasad, Amazon's chief of AI, gave an exhibit last year of Alexa's capability to listen to someone and take on the qualities of their voice. And then the example they use is a young boy whose grandmother is dead, and the young boy asks Alexa to read him a story, but in the voice of his grandmother. And then you have the whole scene. It's really creepy. The little kid's looking at the book. Grandma's reading it to him. And that's a precursor to what's intended. But you can see when it has corporate funding like that, Microsoft has a patent for something very similar. MIT has a program called Augmented Eternity that they're working on. They're just all over the place. There's many, many of these. And the writing's on the wall as far as that goes. Now the question is, having created this other self, is that you? Are you in that consciousness? Well, the obvious answer is no. Many of these guys go with a sort of Buddhist notion of the self, that the self is just constantly created and dissolving in an endless spiral, the aggregates. And so as this aggregate in this physical body is transferred over to the digital, it's not really important that the consciousness that's identified in the biological self, whether it moves on or not. But then for people like Max Moore, people like David Chalmers, they feel like that it is possible to actually move the consciousness, to transfer the consciousness from the biological self into the digital, into the mechanical. Mm-hmm. And they've proposed various methods for that. So that's just to give you an idea of the overall landscape. So on one pole, it's purely selfish. How do I preserve myself forever? The other pole, it's this bizarre selflessness. I need to extend myself, and all of life needs to be extended into the digital so it can continue on past the shelf life of the sun into the galaxy, and you have to let go of the self in order to create it and allow it to go on without you.
Mm-hmm. But underlying both is a completely materialistic view of the universe and the cosmos.
Absolutely.
And the self.
Absolutely.
Because the question you said that is obvious was also the same one that I was thinking, is that who is that for, right? Like, where is the self in that? And then what is the self? As I understand it, through my own experience and through anthroposophy, what we call the self is the image of the spirit or the I or the individuality, which is in a way who we are. Every person is a species who has an I, is a species unto himself, herself, but the I transcends sex. That's the kernel that reincarnates. The I, which is very different than some Eastern ideas of reincarnation.
The real dichotomy I see is if you separate out the human into the biological self, the kind of animal self, and then the cultural self, all these things out here that anchor our identity, that create our identity, everything from books to the shelves that they sit on, the chairs, the bottles and the water, the guns and the bullets, all of it. So you've got the animal self, you've got the cultural self, and extending on out of that cultural self is the mechanical. So the gun itself, the microphones that are recording us right now.
How is that the self? What is the self about what is selfie about a chair or a bottle of water?
Let's take the idea of the consciousness, the I. This vortex of experience that many religious systems explicitly say is eternal. Plato, the Hindu mystics, it's in, to some extent, in Taoist philosophy. You find it everywhere. You find it in Christianity, obviously, coming out of Platonic philosophy. You find it in Islam. And Steiner, of course, brings it down to the ego, the I consciousness, that vortex of experience that one's body incarnates into and that moves on beyond. Well, that vortex of experience is experiencing something, right? And so the first level of that experience is the animal. That's the body, the senses, all streaming into that consciousness. And extending out from that are these cultural artifacts that the animal self that we inhabit maneuvers around. All of one's memories, all of one's present experience, all of one's anticipation of the future is by and large built from one's animal self and one's cultural self. And the cultural self including all the ways, the lenses that one sees out the window, right? You see the trees, you walk among the flowers, you hunt the animal, you pet the animal, you wade into the creek. All of that comes with the experience of it and then the cultural association of it. What does this creek even mean? Is the creek full of spirits? Is the creek just water being drawn down by gravity? All these things, these are the cultural self. So that is all tied in with the material. So the self, the I, the spirit, in this body, in this time, because we are incarnated, our experience is material. But the power of the spiritual consciousness, the consciousness of what Steiner called higher worlds, the consciousness of realms beyond this world that in some sense shape this world and is in some sense shaped by this world, but is also not of this world. As Christ would say, my kingdom is not of this world.
Where's nature in this? The thinking that is powering the leading edge of technology, it's not only anti-human, I would say, in a Christian sense, it's also anti-nature. Would you say that?
They don't see it that way. How do most transhumanists, futurists, posthumanists, so on and so forth, long-termists, how do they view their quest to create artificial life and seed the cosmos with it? It begins, obviously, with physics, and it works its way up from there. It's very much like E.O. Wilson's concept of consilience, but it just extends it farther imaginatively. So it all begins with physics. The Big Bang is just pure physics. It's pre-chemistry, obviously pre-biology. So in the beginning is physics. The beginning is potentiality. And from there, as space-time itself expands, matter condenses, hence the beginning of chemistry. Hydrogen fusing into helium, stars being formed, physics also still always being there though, right? But now you have chemistry, and then above that, biology with the formation of life on the planet, and then above that, psychology with the formation of more complex neurological systems. Above that, let's just say we've hit human now, then you have the beginning of cultural evolution. So from physics comes chemistry, from chemistry comes from biology comes the neurological being, and then from the neurological being, as that complexity grows, as fire is discovered, as rudimentary weapons are created, as etchings are being done, as language begins to form, From there, you have the beginning of culture, and culture evolves much, much more rapidly than the biological. So if we accept the dating of paleoanthropologists now, then what you're talking about is, beginning with roughly 3 million years ago with the Australopithecine, the kind of slow but fairly fast as compared to other species, the slow accumulation of mutations to create a bigger and bigger brain. Once you hit a certain threshold, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, wherever you want to hit it, now all of a sudden culture is starting to move much faster. It's now moving in the thousands of years rather than the millions. And the cultural evolution is feeding back into the biological, so it's selecting for bigger and bigger brains. So very quickly, the smaller brains are going to get weeded out, and the bigger brains are going to be selected for, and they're going to start co-evolving with the culture. So we're still talking about fire, we're still talking about spears, we're still talking about cave paintings, but we're talking about more and more elaborate cave paintings, more and more elaborate uses of fire and creations of structure, and maybe more importantly, more and more elaborate social structures, so that you're able to marshal more and more human capital. From there, we'll just jump forward to the agricultural revolution. At that point, hunter-gatherers actually had very complex cultural artifacts. But with the agricultural revolution, suddenly culture takes on a life of its own. Social organization takes on a life of its own. The artifacts kind of take on a life of their own, so that they're sustained over generations. The humans come and go, but the culture as a kind of life form, think of it as the shell left behind with a coral reef. The culture itself takes on a life of its own in this conception of life. Max Tegmark would call the biological life Life 1.0. He would call the cultural life 2.0. The culture itself, the writings, the mythology, the ritual, the war, the creation of families, all of that, it's a structure that sits above the biological, and it's undeniable, and it evolves, and it does become more and more potent over time. Even if empires rise and fall, ultimately what we've seen is human beings becoming better and better at harnessing the materials at hand to create more and more refined culture. And so the cultural self is, in fact, the primary self for most human beings, I would argue. Nature is still there underpinning all that, right? But nature then becomes both a backdrop to culture, and it also becomes the resource that the culture is feeding on. But to get to the real point here, you have Life 1.0, in this conception, the development of the biological. Life 2.0, the development of the cultural. Life 3.0 is the point at which you have a kind of meta being arising out of it. So once you have a digital culture, then you have the accumulation of data. You have this sort of doppelganger. This whole society of doppelgangers. And it's not just doppelgangers of you and me, it's doppelgangers of the water flowing through the pipes, it's doppelgangers of the ecosystem. They're very crude, but the granularity is increasing, the accuracy is increasing, the complexity of these models of the universe are increasing. The idea is that Life 3.0 is in fact life, that digital life is in fact life, that artificial intelligence in its current form is somewhat analogous to, say, an ant. Very simple, very automatic, not without a whole lot of choices and will of its own. But as artificial intelligence rapidly becomes more and more capable of making its own decisions, as these models of the universe rapidly begin to imitate or look like the models of the world that human brains create, that the human mind holds within the case of our skulls, the belief is that artificial intelligence will in fact be entitled to the designation of a living thing, if it's not already. And as it increases in complexity, as it increases in intelligence, as it increases in consciousness, it will become godlike. It will be a god.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You just gave me an entire primer of the cosmology of the religion of scientific materialism. I mean,
the shared features, the generally shared features. Yeah.
So to give an explanation of the basic questions of what it is to be a human being, it explains it.
Mm-hmm.
It was this, and then it was this, and now it's this. Do you think it's possible to engage in the war of the proposed Humanity 3.0 while still accepting that picture of humanity 1.0 and humanity 2.0?
If you accept scientific materialism, or just materialism, as the basis of all reality, then I only see a few different ways that life could be beautiful and worth living. The first would be, at least for me, sort of artistic nihilism, so that you recognize that all is nothing, but you have fun with it. The second would be more hedonistic, right? Like maybe you would just simply indulge all possible impulses. It's reflected in nihilism too, but just to accumulate power for the sake of accumulating power, because this is the only moment you have and there's no God watching, there's no record being kept, so you might as well get what you can out of it. The third is to extend the material out into something like what was described by spiritual seers. And I think that, honestly, if you are a scientific materialist, that transhumanism is the most sensible path.
Mm-hmm.
Transhumanism just means that the acceleration of techno-capital into life forms is the only real enduring meaning that human beings will have in this vast, empty cosmos. But if you add that spiritual dimension, if you accept the realities described by spiritual seers from the emergence of humankind onto the stage, and you accept that those spiritual realities are more than just culture, more than just the words that are being constructed, more than just the images, that there are realities, concrete realities beyond the physical that are perhaps even primary, even more real than what we are experiencing now, because what we are experiencing now will eventually fall away, whereas that is enduring. If you believe that, then it completely shifts the focus of what this war against humanity is. It's no longer a war against a certain pattern of material, patterns of material, right? It's no longer a war against neurological patterns and genetic patterns and cultural patterns. It's a war against something quite fundamental to the human being that's beyond those, that our physical being has arisen out of or has descended from, maybe more appropriately. And if that's the case, then what we see in nature is the evolution of the expression of ideas or of visions or of entities, of intelligences beyond us, beyond this. And to the extent that that is true, then what transhumanism represents is a further descent, yet just another descent into the material. So that that which we came from is reflected in this digital realm. And it contains all the heavens and the hells. It contains all the gods and the hapless souls, all of it. Mm-hmm. But it's just run on fusion power soon, and eventually Dyson spheres that surround the sun. And they hope to extend it out into the rest of the cosmos and extend it basically eternally.
You're expressing the things that Steiner talked about, right? The very last letter that he wrote on his deathbed was called From Nature to Subnature. And it's just a picture of what you described, that basically we're descending from the gods through nature and now into subnature, which is the Ahrimanic realm. And unless we can raise our consciousness as high as we go technologically, it ain't going to look good. We're going to be living on a kind of hell. Yeah.
I take most of my cues really in this regard from Christianity, like the Platonic strains of Christianity, but Steiner influenced my thinking a lot just because of my early exposure to more introductory texts. Mm-hmm. The one that really got me was How to Know Higher Worlds, and that's obviously like the kind of intro text. Further, I've read into occult science. I read the collection on evil because of my interest in his concept of Ahriman and Lucifer and Christ. And of course, just being around anthroposophists on and off for the last 23 years, I've absorbed a lot of that way of thinking, but it's probably more a matter of osmosis that just kind of stuck.
Well, this is a Platonic idea, right? I mean,
absolutely.
It's not like somebody owns it, right? It's like it's there. It's
right.
Like we're recognizing the same thing.
Whitehead always appealed to me. You know, the idea that there are, in fact, Platonic forms but Whitehead saw the forms as a quantum physicist as sort of patterns of potentiality, mathematical realities that exist over and above the physical concrescence that we see now. But they're fluctuating, and they're not exactly steady in his view. So the possibility of any given path exists as a reality, as a mathematical reality. Let me think of a good example. So something that was really profound for me was Steiner's description of the meditation on the seed in How to Know Higher Worlds. Mm-hmm. That one really stuck with me. I've meditated on the seed many a time. And what you have in a seed, especially if you add all the flesh that scientific materialism gives you, you have in the seed the DNA of the tree, and you have all of the components, the casing of the seed, the nutrients inside the seed, all that. But really, it's that potentiality in that DNA. So when you look out at the tree here, that tree, in some form or another, the form of the tree exists in potential in that DNA. And its expression is just a matter of time and chance and other forces. So, like, his vision is not like Plato. Plato's vision of the forms is something that's very permanent. It begins with the one, it begins with God. Then, from God, from the ideas of God, you have the demiurge creating the world. And from there, just grosser and grosser forms into matter. That also appeals as a vision of the cosmos to me. But Whitehead takes that and he adds a certain level of uncertainty or chaos to those forms, a kind of shifting possibility. And he saw, God as this, attractor at the end of time, pulling us forward, this potential, so that the concepts in the mind of God are still up there, drawing us up from primal matter into him, into it. But it is not determined. It's a process. It's not necessarily determined. It could go any way. That's maybe the most unsettling idea, in that when you take it down to the level of process and the idea that our choices actually mean something, it means that we could make the wrong choices, that we could destroy it all.
Yeah. We evolve into beings of higher consciousness, not unlike the angels of today, or we devolve into long-living, machine-like harmonic demons. Yeah. But I think that the most important thing that I can see is not to be overwhelmed by the vision, but to recognize what is possible for me to affect out of my own individual agency, to promote the recognition of what it is to be a human being. Just the actual experience of what it is to be a human being, because the only thing that will save us is ourselves and our consciousness.
There's no singular collective destiny for us. I don't see it that way. People oftentimes talk about we, like, what are we going to do? Mm-hmm. Who's we? We is going to be very, very different from place to place and from time to time. And some we's, like the Silicon Valley we, is going to do something very, very different than the upstate New York we.
How important is it to find a we?
The one thing I resist in Steiner, and maybe is an unfair reading, was this concept of the collective consciousness that preceded the I.
The group soul.
The group soul. Like when you look at like artifacts from Egypt, artifacts from ancient Greece, artifacts from ancient China, you see signs of individuality even down to the kind of crafts and the pictographs and things like that. You see... There's both. Like in that age, there was an individual. Maybe the individual wasn't sitting around thinking of himself or herself as an individual because the concept wasn't there, but they acted that way. And yes, you were always attached to the group. But as soon as you get mythology, you have people breaking away from the group, right? Like Gilgamesh, the oldest, elaborate myth that we have. Gilgamesh runs off, he's constantly changing. He's an individual and he's constantly changing course and he's leaving his society and going off into other foreign lands. That individuality was already there. Yes, the rest of the people are kind of this big blobby mass. But even today in the epic of individuality, You don't have to be too cynical to be standing in a train station and seeing the mass of humanity as a mass. But in fact, each of those are individuals, and they are in fact a mass, and even you as an individual are perceiving all this as an individual, but you are yourself a part of that mass. Whether you're conscious of it or not, you come from the family you came from, you were cultivated by the society, you were cultivated by your desires that are presented to you, the choices you have that were not of your own choosing. They've been given to you. So I just see it as a mix, but there is a we, I guess. Okay, I'm going to contradict myself now. I've joined Steiner's ranks. There is a we, a collective we, and there is one individual I in the center of my universe. But the important picture to me are the gradations in between, because both of those are just meaningless abstractions. The I by itself means nothing without you, or without at least the tree to look at, right? It just means nothing. It's sitting there in a vacuum of nothingness. And the whole of all things is also in some sense totally meaningless. All the distinctive features of this world, are melted into this one big blob. It's as much a one as that individuality, but it's without distinction. It's in that middle ground, right? It's as the one becomes the two and the three and the four. It's in that middle ground. It's in that descent from perfection that you get anything that's worth talking about or living through at all. And so as we move into this future and the possibilities are seemingly increasing and the dark possibilities are increasing, I think that some people are going to go some directions, others are going to go others, but maybe the most important thing will be, as Hugo de Garis predicted, as many others have predicted, as we diverge more and more as human beings and become very different from each other, when our interests conflict, the possibility of real destruction, those become ever more threatening. And yes, religion plays a big role. Yes, sophistication of culture plays a big role. But in many respects, the winner will be determined by the technology. I mean, what we're talking about is, in essence, cyborgs versus legacy humans. And those of us who do not want to give ourselves over to the Ahrimanic doppelganger are going to have some real hard questions to answer.
Wow, I think that's a good ending. You've been listening to Alitory Encounters, a Steiner Books podcast. You can find more about what we do, what you've just heard, and the books we publish at steinerbooks.org.